So our speaker for today is Dr. Weil, who is familiar to all of us at the Honors College. He's a graduate of the College of William and Mary and earned his PhD in government from the University of Virginia. He has attended seminars sponsored by the National Endowment for Humanities at Princeton and the University of Iowa. He has served as the chair of the Department of Social Science at McNeese State University, chair of the Department of Political Science here at MTSU, and of course, since 2008, he has been the dean of the University Honors College. Dr. Weil is a scholar of the U.S. constitutional amending process and has written and edited numerous books, essays, chapters, and reviews on this topic and related topics. He has received the MTSU Foundation Distinguished Research Award twice, and most recently the Career Achievement Award in 2011. His most recent publication, which is coming out on September 19th, is The Bible in American Law and Politics. And you can see there he's holding it up. He's got the advanced copy in the Honors College right now. Other recent publications are American's National Anthem, The Star-Spangled Banner in U.S. History, Culture, and Law, and relevant to his lecture today, The Liberty Bell and Its Legacy, an encyclopedia of an American icon in U.S. history and culture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Weil.
Interested in studying documents, U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the Bible, and American symbols, which have included a book that I did on the American flag, one that's actually, I've had it the printer forever, but hasn't still been released on the national anthem. And then the most recent book that I did, well, prior to the one on the Bible here, The Liberty Bell and Its Legacy. And I know in the very first lecture that Father John gave, you had some discussion of the difference between an idol and an icon and whatever. And long before I knew that I was going to be part of this lecture series, the subtitle of The Liberty Bell and Its Legacy is an encyclopedia of an American icon in U.S. history and culture. The Liberty Bell obviously is not something that you would worship, but it is something that for many people, including myself, brings back fond memories. I went to, at William and Mary, we had a bell that was sort of a central part of the campus. And obviously the bell plays a significant role here in the Honors College. We hope to ring it for each of you as you complete your honors thesis here. And I often think, when you think of bells, you think sort of collective memory, and you think back in time. And there must have been a time in the United States where instead of hearing sirens and fire engines and tornado alarms, where one of the primary things that you would have heard collectively, if you lived in a small town, would have been the ringing of the bells. And I think there's a certain, I don't know if primal is the right word for it, but there's a certain quality of bells that sort of take us back to an earlier time. One of the things that I find interesting is for many, many years, my wife taught, and almost every year I would talk to her classes, and usually I talked to like 4th through 6th graders. And I usually went with the intention, this will soon be Constitution Week, of talking about the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. And much to my frustration, I found that if I mentioned Independence Hall and made the mistake of telling them it's where the Liberty Bell was, almost immediately I would be deluged with questions. How tall is it? What's it made of? How old is it? How did it crack? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the time I knew almost nothing about the Liberty Bell. And so I tried just to leave it out of my presentations. But since then, I've become fairly interested in it. I also would not have written a book on it. It is located, as I've indicated, in Philadelphia, which was one of the principal cities. If I remember correctly, Philadelphia at the time of the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution was actually the second largest English-speaking country in the world, next only to London, although there was a major difference in the population between the two of them. Most of you know Pennsylvania traces its roots back to William Penn, one of the great heroes, I think, of American founding. He was a Quaker, as many of you know, fleeing religious persecution. One of the things that he did in Philadelphia, much in Pennsylvania, much before the New England colonies or even those in the South, was to establish pretty full religious liberty. In 1701, William Penn granted a charter to the colony of Pennsylvania in which this was explained. And initially, bells, we find it hard to think of people walking around without, I was going to say watches, but cell phones, I guess is what we would say now. But, there was a time where not everybody would have had a clock prominently displayed in their house, or a watch or a cell phone. And so the purpose of bells was often sort of official. If there were a fire, you'd ring the bell X number of times. If there was a threatened invasion, you would ring it. And you would also ring it, you would have legislative sessions in Philadelphia because it was the capital of the colony. And so as legislators were there, you would ring it to let them know that it was time for everybody to assemble. And indeed, the very first bell that we know about for this purpose was actually a smaller bell that somebody brought over and hung from a tree. And that was, 1901-ish. And in 1750, the city decided that it needed a larger bell. Now, there's still, the evidence is more circumstantial than conclusionary, but a lot of people believe that it may very well be that this bell was ordered in connection with what would have been the 50th anniversary of Penn's granting of the charter. So the charter was granted 1701. I don't think it got there actually in 1751, but it was planned to get there in 1751. It was ordered from a company, Thomas Lister of the Whitechapel Foundry in England, which until about 5 or 10 years ago was one of the oldest manufacturing companies in England. It since sold the property for $2 or $3 million, or million pounds, I guess I should say. And I don't believe it's any longer in existence, but it was a fairly large bell, just over a ton, 2,080 pounds. And one of the significant features of the bell, which is fairly unusual as far as I can tell for bells of the time, is, to see that I came not only with my tie, but a little something you could remember today by. It is inscribed around the top with a passage from the Bible, actually Leviticus 25:10, which says, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all the inhabitants thereof." If any of you have seen the movie, Cecil B. DeMille's, I believe it is, movie on the Ten Commandments, at the one of the closing scenes where Moses is headed off to the mountain where he's going to die, he strikes a pose similar to the Liberty Bell, and then he reads or he proclaims this verse. So that suggests that it's part of a broader American consciousness since that time. So the bell came over. Everybody was very excited. They brought it off the ship, hung it up, or hang, whichever it is. They put it from a tree, and somebody banged on it, and you guessed it. First thing that happened was that it cracked. There's still dispute. We know that the ship was in some rough waters on the way, and so there's always a chance that it cracked in voyage. There's also a chance that the people in Philadelphia, had never rung a bell this large and weren't quite sure how to do it, and that it cracked then. Some of you will be pleased to know that in the bicentennial year, 1976, a group of Americans showed up in England outside this Whitechapel Foundry. They were called themselves the American Procrastinator Society, and said that they wanted a refund on the bell, and the society responded if they would bring the original packaging, that they would be glad to provide it. Of course, the original package was long gone. But in any event, two locals stepped forward. They mostly cast frying pans and buckets and things like that. But two individuals, John Pass and John Stowe, whose names are, it'll say at the bottom, Pass and Snow, Philadelphia, and then the date, they agreed to recast the bell, the largest project they had undertaken. They did so, but when they rang it, there was a lot of displeasure. People said that it didn't sound very good. It sounded more like a gong than a bell. They were a little embarrassed. There was some discussion about it. They recast it. And so what we call the Liberty Bell is actually the third casting of an original bell. And just to fill out the story, there was yet another bell that was brought over that was a twin to the Liberty Bell, later from England, and it was used to run a clock, or to ring at the hour of a clock that was hung outside Independence Hall. So Liberty Bell's there. It's used mostly, apparently, to call people to special events. It seems to have rung a good number of times, as you would guess, during the French and Indian War. There's still dispute. There's a lot of stories about the Liberty Bell ringing in the American Revolution, July 4th in particular, but we don't actually know if that happened. We know that the structure in which the bell was enclosed was in disrepair, and there was some concern that ringing the bell might bring it down. And so sometimes you'll see it in lists, but usually it's with a little asterisk that we're not actually sure that it rang there. But it clearly became identified with the revolutionary cause. By the way, in 1777, the bell was removed from Independence Hall, what was then known as the Pennsylvania State House, and taken to the Zion Reformed Church in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which still has a little museum there in the basement commemorating the fact that it had been there. Now, surprisingly, some of the things that we revere today were not necessarily as appreciated in their own time as they are now. And one of those, surprisingly, is what we today call Independence Hall. The state capital of Pennsylvania actually moved. Pennsylvania Hall was the gathering point for both the Declaration of Independence and the writing of the U.S. Constitution. But the state capital subsequently moved. The building came in disrepair, and apparently it wasn't until 1824 that people began to, and that date is significant, by the way, the Baron de Lafayette, who had been with George Washington in the Revolutionary War, visited America, and they hosted him there at Independence Hall, which in the meantime, they had added buildings in the vicinity, and there was a dog pound in the basement and all kinds of things that we today would consider somewhat blasphemous. But nonetheless, this visit by Lafayette sort of renewed interest in the Liberty Bell. Now, it wasn't called, to my knowledge, it wasn't called the Liberty Bell initially. It was the Great Bell, or the bell at the State House, or some such. But 1826 marks sort of another important date in American history. It's the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And some of you know that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams simultaneously died on that day. And to a people that often connected patriotism and nationalism with religion, this seemed almost a divine sign. God is giving his sanction on our country. Why else would two of the most eminent people of the age die on the same day? And sometime in this period, probably from about 1826 to 1835 or 40, the bell cracked. And there are all kinds of stories about how it happened. The most common is that it may have cracked on ringing the bell for the death of George Washington, or one of the commemorations of the death of George Washington. Another is that it was cracked when it was rung for the death of Chief Justice John Marshall on the Supreme Court. But the truth is, we don't have a definitive. We have some accounts, usually from 30 or 40 years later, but we're not sure whether they're completely valid or not. What we do know is that the Liberty Bell took on a kind of, symbols sometimes change in what they mean. Symbol for one generation might mean something very different to a generation that follows. And the biggest thing, two things that happened in the history of the Liberty Bell that sort of made it the Liberty Bell was that it, or a bell like it, with the same words, proclaim liberty throughout all the land, all the inhabitants thereof, began to be pictured in a series of books that was published every Christmas by abolitionists. And so the Liberty Bell became a symbol for the abolitionist movement, even though, when it was created in the 1750s and, later even the American Revolution, that did not in and of itself, obviously, free the slaves. So that's one thing that contributed to its greater recognition. And the other, and this shows how mythology can often envelop icons or symbols. In 1847, there's a gentleman by the name of George Lippard, who is, by the way, a friend, and this is my bow to Dr. Phillips, a friend of Edgar Allan Poe, who is one of his favorite authors, who published a story that ended up apparently in almost all the textbooks of the 19th century for school children. And it was a story that told of the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And according to the story, there's a wizened old man in the tower of Independence Hall, and he's waiting to hear whether voting for independence has taken place. And at last, this flaxen-headed young person comes up and he says, "Ring, Grandpa, ring." And they begin ringing the bell. And so people, not only are they now associating the Liberty Bell with abolitionism, but it has an even greater tie to the American Revolution than it probably had at the time that it was founded. Now, one of the, I don't know if there's a philosophical way of discussing this or not, but if you think of icons, there are some structures that are fixed. If you think in American history, probably the greatest challenger in I think the most popular icon in American history is the U.S. flag. And one of the beauties of the flag is that you can carry it, you can make copies of it, you can display it just about anywhere. By contrast, something that comes later, the Statue of Liberty, is fixed in a single space. So we've all probably seen pictures of the Liberty Bell, particularly 4th of July and other occasions, but not nearly as many of us have actually visited. So the Liberty Bell holds sort of a medium place between the two. Now, right now, it's in a fixed position. It's been moved in the last 50 years. It was moved once out of Independence Hall into one display area, and then that subsequently became inadequate, and it was moved to another. But if you want to see the actual Liberty Bell, you go to Philadelphia. Now, by the way, there's a replica in every state, including one on the state capitol grounds in Nashville. There are a number of colleges and universities that have replicas of the Liberty Bell. There are even some private individuals. But as stationary as we regard it today, there was a period from 1885 to 1915 in which the Liberty Bell took 7 trips. And at the end of these trips, it's estimated that as many as 1 out of every 4 people in the United States had actually viewed the Liberty Bell. So I want to talk a little bit about these trips. And by the way, they sort of show what an icon can do. Now, if you think about the dates, the Civil Wars, ends in 1865. Reconstruction continues until 1877. And so the 1880s is a period where, you have sort of a resurgence of white nationalism in the South. You still have very hard feelings often between North and South. And you'll notice when we look at the itinerary here that a number of the places that the Liberty Bell visited were in the South. And that was very purposeful because it was thought that this would be a way of unifying. So let's start in 1885. And the first example is one of the best. Liberty Bell goes to the World Industrial and Cotton Exposition in New Orleans. On the way, it is met in Biloxi, Mississippi by Jefferson Davis, who made some rather silly remarks. And on the way back, I guess it was there. On the way, it passed through Nashville, Tennessee at 8 a.m. on January the 25th of 1885. And as far as I can tell, that's the closest physically or thereabouts that the Liberty Bell ever got to Murfreesboro, Tennessee. So went there, came back. 1893, it goes to the World Columbia Exposition in Chicago. If you remember the Alabaster Cities Gleam, this is a reference to that exposition. 1895, it goes to the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition. Some of you may know of a speech that Booker T. Washington gave there, which seemed to foreshadow racial segregation. 1902, it visits Charleston, South Carolina for the Interstate and West Indian Exposition. 1903, goes briefly to Boston for the Battle of Bunker Hill. 1904, Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, Missouri. And then finally, in 1915, its longest trip, San Francisco, Panama Pacific Exposition, and it also stops by the Panama, California Exposition in San Diego. Eventually, these trips were stopped in part because of increasing fears over the structural integrity of the Liberty Bell. It already had a crack in it, and there were some reports that this crack was widening, and they made all kinds of preparations, special springs on the boxcars that it rode on and the like. By the way, a lot of people would camp out beside the railroad track. If you knew that the Liberty Bell was coming through, you'd start a campfire and people would wave and clap and cheer as the Liberty Bell went by, or they try to meet it at the station. Now, I remember Father John mentioning, and I forget what the icon was, but he mentioned kissing an icon and the significance of that. And one of the notable things about the Liberty Bell is that when it took tours, it was very common to you'd either take out a piece of jewelry or a pen or something and have them rub it up against the Liberty Bell, sort of like a charm, almost like a St. Christopher medal or something like that. And then it was also common to lift children and they would kiss the Liberty Bell. And by the way, this created a riot in Texas when, one poor African-American child got up and kissed the bell, and people went crazy that, what was an African-American doing? But in any event, there was increased concern about the physical security of the Liberty Bell. So it's been, apart from the movement to these two halls that I mentioned, fairly stationary since 1915. Now, I mentioned the Liberty Bell, at least retroactively, being a symbol of the American Revolution. It subsequently becomes a symbol of the abolitionist movement. It also is used by women's suffragists. In Pennsylvania, there is a replica of a Liberty Bell that is made, and the clapper is frozen so that it cannot be rung until the 19th Amendment, the 100th anniversary of which we just celebrated, was adopted. It turns out, by the way, that Pennsylvania was not one of the states that ratified that amendment, at least not initially. But in any event, in World War I, the Liberty Bell was used prominently in advertisements or pleas for Liberty bonds. In World War II, it was common for people who were enlisting to take their oaths in front of the Liberty Bell. Many of you know that in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech. Now, I can't positively tell you that he had the Liberty Bell in mind, but I think that he did. And I feel fairly confident that many people who listened to the speech would have thought that he did. Let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring, and now it goes to, if you know, Stone Mountain, Georgia, is one of the places that was very prominent for Klan rallies. And of course, subsequently, the side of that hill has engravings of major generals. So he says, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain in Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. Again, not a direct mention of the Liberty Bell, but I think almost anybody who would have, American who heard that, would know probably of that association. Now, I don't know if you've talked at all about blasphemy or sacrilege, but that's something that sometimes comes up in discussions of icons. When I did my book on the American flag, one of the most provocative things that a person can do is to burn the American flag. And, even now, with the partial resumption, at least, of football, we still have great controversy over, is it disrespectful? And in fact, if I recall correctly, when Colin Kaepernick first began the protest for, what we typically would call Black Lives Movement, originally, if I recall, he sat or simply stood with his hands at his side. I forget which it is, but he subsequently would take a knee, which was considered to be, he considered, and most observers considered, to be a more respectful way. It's almost like, it's not that I don't love the flag, I don't think the flag is living up to the principles. And that's sort of what King is saying, right? Freedom is not, freedom is an ideal, liberty is an ideal, we haven't reached it there. Let's get to the point where we have just as much liberty at Lookout Mountain and at Stone Mountain as we would in the Rockies or in the Northeast or somewhere else. But, and by the way, just as some of you may know this, it's not uncommon to see someone often mentally unbalanced take a hammer to a religious object. It's happened to the Pieta. There have been one or two attacks on the Liberty Bell. Again, someone probably not completely of sound mind. But on April 1st of 1996, if you had opened the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, which most people consider sort of, top drawer publications in the United States, you would have seen the following announcement. It would have told you that the Taco Bell had purchased the Liberty Bell, and they were now going to call this the Taco Liberty Bell. Now, Taco Bell didn't tell anybody else what was up, and so the folks at Pennsylvania, wherever, Pennsylvania Hall, The folks there, Independence Hall, folks got deluged with calls from all over the United States. What a sacrilege. You're taking this sacred icon of American history and you sold it to the highest bidder. And Taco Bell, you know, they played it up, you know, half the year it would stay in Philadelphia, but the other half of the year it would be moved to their headquarters in California. And then, of course, by middle of the day, Taco Bell said, you know, it is April 1st. This is meant to be a joke. The White House press secretary said that we'll be doing a series of these. Ford Motor Company is joining today in an effort to refurbish the Lincoln Memorial. It will now be called the Lincoln Mercury Memorial. But as it turns out, no harm was done. It remains in federal custody for better or worse. I think that the bell remains a fairly vibrant symbol. It's all in the name, right? I mean, Statue of Liberty and a Liberty Bell. The notion of proclaiming liberty, a little mix of church and state, and that it has an inscription that's a biblical inscription. So it appeals to a fairly large variety of people. As I've said, there was a bond movement, savings bond movement in the 1950s, where each state, after they met their quota, was given a replica of the Liberty Bell. And there are others that are scattered throughout the United States. There are bells elsewhere in the world. There's one on Omaha Beach, if I recall correctly, that's similar to the Liberty Bell. There's a bell in Berlin, Germany, which is sort of patterned after the Liberty Bell. By the way, there's an article that claims that most people would recognize the Liberty Bell simply either by the shape or the shape of the crack. And sometimes I think you can recognize it if you just see the piece of wood that it hangs from in the bell. But nonetheless, it's a fairly iconic image. Some of you are probably familiar with Leonard Cohen, Canadian, yes, died fairly recently. He wrote a chorus in 1992 called The Anthem. And I think it makes a good point of maybe to turn this over to Dr. King. But I have often wondered if part of the appeal of the Liberty Bell, and this is more me speculating than it is anything that I can prove, but maybe part of the attraction is the fact that it is flawed. It has a crack. Our commitment to liberty doesn't always ring quite as true as it does. Our commitment to equality and justice, often, as all earthly things do, they fall short probably of what, the framers anticipated that they would. And Cohen has this line in Anthem, and it says this. It says, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." So why don't we stop there and see if that maybe provides a point of reflection or questions.
That was lovely, Dean Weil. Thank you very much. Thank you for the Canadian content, Cohen. It's near and dear to my heart. I think that that's a really beautiful and profound way to think about the role of icons and our own relationships to them, broadly speaking. Please join me in thanking Dr. Weil for this really fascinating discussion today and for giving us his time. And you are all free to go, but we will stick around if anyone has anything else they want to talk about.